U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils. This is from cgtn.com. U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils from the Chinese government on U.S. Leadership, I guess you could call it. Political hegemony throwing its weight around. Military hegemony, wanton use of force. Economic hegemony, looting and exploitation. And technological hegemony, monopoly and suppression. Finally, cultural hegemony, spreading false narratives. Introduction. Since becoming the world's most powerful country after the two world wars and the Cold War, the U.S. has acted more boldly to interfere in the international affairs or the internal affairs of other countries, pursue, maintain and abuse hegemony, advance subversion and infiltration, and willfully wage wars, bringing harm to the international community. The U.S. has developed a hegemonic playbook to stage color revolutions, instigate regional disputes, and even directly launch wars under the guise of promoting democracy, freedom, and human rights, clinging to the Cold War mentality. The U.S. has ramped up bloc politics, instilled conflict and confrontation. It's overstretched the concept of national security, abused export controls, and forced unilateral sanctions upon others. It's taken a selective approach to international law and rules, utilizing or discarding them as it sees fit, and has sought to impose rules that serve its own interests in the name of upholding rules-based international order. This report, by presenting the relevant facts, seeks to expose the U.S. abuse of hegemony in the political, military, economic, financial, technological, and cultural fields, and to draw greater international attention to the perils of the U.S. practices to world peace and stability and the well-being of all peoples. Political hegemony, throwing its weight around. The U.S. has been long attempting to mold other countries in the world order with its own values and political system in the name of promoting democracy and human rights. Instances of U.S. interference in other countries' internal affairs abound in the name of promoting democracy. The U.S. practiced the Neo-Monroe Doctrine in late Latin America, instigated color revolutions in Eurasia, and orchestrated the Arab Spring in West Asia and North Africa, bringing chaos and disaster to many countries. In 1823, the United States announced the Monroe Doctrine while touting an America for the Americans. What's truly wanted was an America for the United States. Since then, the policies of successive U.S. governments toward Latin America and the Caribbean region have been riddled with political interference, military intervention, and regime subversion. From its 61-year hostility toward and blockade of Cuba to its overthrow of the Allende government of Chile, U.S. policy on this region has been built on one maxim: those who submit will prosper. Those who resist shall perish. This year, 2003, marked the beginning of the successive color revolutions: the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. The U.S. Department of State openly admitted playing a central role in those regime changes. The U.S. also interfered in the international affairs of the Philippines, ousting President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. in 1986 and Joseph Estrada in 2001 through the so-called People Power revolutions. In January 2023, former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo released his new book, Never Give an Inch, Fighting for the America I Love. He revealed in it that the United States had plotted to intervene in Venezuela. The plan was to force the Maduro government to reach an agreement with the opposition, deprive Venezuela of its ability to sell oil and gold for foreign exchange, exert high pressure on its economy, and influence the 2018 presidential election. The U.S. exercises double standards on international rules, placing its self-interest first. The U.S. has walked away from international treaties and organizations and put its domestic law above international law. In April 2017, the Trump administration announced that they would cut off all U.S. funding to the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, with the excuse that the organization supports or participates in the management of a program or coercive abortion or involuntary sterilization. The U.S. quit UNESCO twice in 1984 and 2017. In 2017, it announced leaving the Paris Agreement on climate change. In 2018, it announced its exit from the UN Human Rights Council, citing the organization's bias against Israel and failure to protect human rights effectively. In 2019, the U.S. announced its withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty to seek the unfettered development of advanced weapons. In 2020, it announced pulling out of the Treaty on Open Skies. The U.S. has also been been a stumbling block to biological arms control by opposing negotiations on a verification protocol for the Biological Weapons Convention and impeding internal verification of countries' activities relating to biological weapons. As the only country in possession of a chemical weapon stockpile, the U.S. has repeatedly delayed the destruction of chemical weapons and remained reluctant in fulfilling its obligation. It's become the biggest obstacle to realizing a world free of chemical weapons. The U.S. is piecing together small blocks through its alliance system. It's been forcing an Indo-Pacific strategy onto the Asia-Pacific region, assembling exclusive clubs like the Five Eyes, the Quad, and the AUKUS, and forcing regional countries to take sides. Such practices are essentially meant to create division in the region, stoke confrontation, and undermine peace. The U.S. arbitrarily passes judgment on democracy in other countries and fabricates a false narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism to incite estrangement, division, rivalry, and confrontation. In December 2021, the U.S. hosted the first Summit for Democracy, which drew criticism for opposition from many countries for making a mockery of the spirit of democracy and dividing the world. In March 2023, the U.S. will host another Summit for Democracy, which remains unwelcome and will again find no support. Military hegemony, wanton use of force. The history of the U.S. is characterized by violence and expansion since it gained independence in 1776. The U.S. has constantly sought expansion by force. It slaughtered Indians, invaded Canada, waged a war against Mexico, instigated the American-Spanish War, and annexed Hawaii. After World War II, the wars either provoked or launched by the U.S. included the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War, Libyan, and the Syrian War, abusing its military hegemony to pave the way for expansionist objectives. In recent years, the U.S. average annual military budget has exceeded $700 billion, accounting for 40% of the world's totals, more than the 15 countries behind it combined. The U.S. States has about 800 overseas military bases with 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. According to the book America Invades, How We've Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth, the United States has fought or been militarily involved with almost all the 190-odd countries recognized by the United Nations, with only 3 exceptions. The 3 countries were spared because the U.S. did not find them on the map. A former U.S. President, Jimmy Carter, put it in the United States is undoubtedly the most warlike nation in the history of the world. According to a Tufts University report introducing the Military Intervention Project, a new data set on U.S. military inventions, 1776 to 2019, the U.S. undertook nearly 400 military interventions globally between those years, 34% of which were in Latin America and the Caribbean, 23% in East Asia and the Pacific, 14% in the Middle East and North Africa, and 13% in Europe. Currently, its military intervention in the Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa is on the rise. Alex Lowe, a South China Morning Post columnist, pointed out that the U.S. has rarely distinguished between diplomacy and war since its founding. It overthrew democratically elected governments in many developing countries in the 20th century and immediately replaced them with American puppet regimes. Today in Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen, the U.S. is repeating its old tactics of waging proxy, low-intensity, and drone wars. U.S. military hegemony has caused humanitarian tragedies. Since 2001, the wars and military operations launched by the U.S. in the name of fighting terrorism have claimed over 900,000 lives, with some 335,000 of them civilians, injured millions, and displaced tens of millions. The 2003 Iraq War resulted in some 200,000 to 250,000 civilian deaths, including over 16,000 directly killed by the U.S. military and left more than 1 million homeless. The U.S. has created 37 million refugees around the world. Since 2012, the number of Syrian refugees alone has increased tenfold. Between 2016 and 2019, 33,584 civilian deaths were documented in the Syrian fighting, including 3,833 killed by the U.S.-led coalition bombings, half of them women and children. The Public Broadcasting Service reported on November 9, 2018, that the airstrikes launched by U.S. forces on Raqqa alone killed 1,600 Syrian civilians. The 2-decade-long war in Afghanistan devastated the country. A total of 47,000 Afghan civilians and 66,000 to 69,000 Afghan soldiers and police officers unrelated to the September 11 attacks were killed in U.S. military operations, and more than 10 million people were displaced. The war in Afghanistan destroyed the foundation of economic development there and plunged the Afghan people into destitution. After the Kabul debacle in 2021, the U.S. announced that it would freeze some $9.5 billion in assets belonging to the Afghan Central Bank, a move considered pure looting. In September 2022, Turkish Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu commented at a rally that the U.S. has waged a proxy war in Syria, turned Afghanistan into an opium field and heroin factory, thrown Pakistan into turmoil, and left Libya in incessant civil unrest. The U.S. does whatever it takes to rob and enslave the people of any country with underground resources. The U.S. has also adopted appalling methods in war during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, the war in Afghanistan, and the Iraq War. The United States used massive quantities of chemical and biological weapons, as well as cluster bombs, fuel air bombs, graphite bombs, and depleted uranium bombs, causing enormous damage on civilian facilities, countless civilian casualties, and lasting environmental pollution. Economic hegemony, looting, and exploitation. After World War II, the U.S. led efforts to set up the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which together with the Marshall Plan formed the international monetary system centered around the U.S. dollar. In addition, the U.S. has established institutional hegemony in the international economic and financial sector by manipulating the weighted voting systems, rules, the arrangements of international organizations, including approval by 85% majority, and its domestic trade laws and regulations. By taking advantage of the dollar status as the major international reserve currency, the U.S. is basically collecting seigniorage from around the world and using its control over international organizations.
Seigniorage.
Profit made by a government by issuing currency, especially the difference between the face value of coins and their production costs. Interesting. It coerces other countries into serving America's political and economic strategy. The U.S. exploits the world's wealth with the help of its seigniorage. It costs only about 17 cents to produce a $100 bill, but other countries had to pony up $100 worth of actual goods in order to obtain one. It was pointed out more than half a century ago that the U.S. enjoyed exorbitant privilege and deficit without tears created by its dollar, or tears created by its dollar, and used the worthless paper note to plunder the resources and factories of other nations. The hegemony of the U.S. dollar is the main source of instability and uncertainty in the world economy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. abused its global financial hegemony and injected trillions of dollars into the global market, leaving other countries, especially emerging economies, to pay the price. In 2022, the Fed ended its ultra-easy monetary policy and turned to its aggressive interest rate hikes, causing turmoil in the international financial market and substantial depreciation of other currencies such as the euro, many of which dropped to a 20-year low. As a result, a large number of developing countries were challenged by high inflation, currency depreciation, and capital outflows. This was exactly what Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, John Connally, once remarked with self-satisfaction yet sharp precision: "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." With its control over international economic and financial organizations, the U.S. imposes additional conditions for assisting other countries. In order to reduce obstacles to U.S. capital inflow and speculation, the recipient countries are required to advance financial liberalization and open up financial markets so that their economic policies would fall in line with America's strategy. According to the Review of International Political Economy, along with the 1,550 debt relief programs extended by the IMF to its 131 member countries from 1985 to 2014, as many as 55,465 additional political conditions had been attached. The U.S. willfully suppresses its opponents with economic coercion in the 1980s to eliminate the economic threat posed by Japan in control, and used the latter in service of America's strategic goal of confronting the Soviet Union and dominating the world. The U.S. leveraged its hegemonic financial power against Japan and concluded the Plaza Accord. As a result, the yen was pushed up and Japan was pressed to open its financial market and reform its financial system. The Plaza Accord dealt a heavy blow to the growth momentum of the Japanese economy, leaving Japan to what was later called 3 lost decades. America's economic and financial hegemony has become a geopolitical weapon, doubling down on unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. The U.S. has enacted such domestic laws as the International Emergency Economies Powers Act and the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act and the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, and introduced a series of executive orders to sanction specific countries, organizations, or individuals. Statistics show that the U.S. sanctions against foreign entities increased by 933% from 2000 to 2021. The Trump administration alone has imposed more than 3,900 sanctions, which means 3 sanctions per day. So far, the United States had or has imposed economic sanctions on nearly 40 countries across the world, including Cuba, China, Russia, the DPRK, Iran, Venezuela, affecting nearly half of the world's populations. The U.S. of America has turned itself into the U.S. of sanctions, and long-arm jurisdiction has been reduced to nothing but a tool for the U.S. to use its means of state power to suppress economic competitors and interfere in normal international business. This is a series of departure from the principles of liberal market economy that the U.S. has long boasted. Technological hegemony, monopoly, and suppression. The U.S. seeks to deter other countries' scientific, technological, and economic development by wielding monopoly power, suppression measures, and technology restrictions in high-tech fields. The U.S. monopolizes intellectual property in the name of protection, taking advantage of the weak position of other countries, especially developing ones, on intellectual property rights and the institutional vacancy in relevant fields. The U.S. reaped excessive profits through monopoly. In 1994, the United States pushed forward the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, forcing the Americanized process and standards in intellectual property protection in an attempt to solidify its monopoly on technology. In the 80s, to contain the development of Japan's semiconductor industry, the U.S. states launched the 301 investigation, built bargaining power and bilateral negotiations through multilateral agreements, threatened to label Japan as conducting unfair trade and impose retaliatory tariffs, forcing Japan to sign the U.S.-Japan Semiconductor Agreement. As a result, Japanese semiconductor enterprises were almost completely driven out of global competition, and their market share dropped from 50% to 10%. Meanwhile, with the support of the U.S. government, a large number of U.S. semiconductor enterprises took the opportunity and grabbed a larger market share. The U.S. politicizes and weaponizes technological issues and uses them as ideological tools. Overstretching the concept of national security, the U.S. mobilized state power to suppress and sanction Chinese company Huawei, restricted the entry of Huawei products into the U.S. market, cut off its supply of chips and operating systems, and coerced other countries to ban Huawei from undertaking local 5G network construction. It even talked Canada into unwarrantedly detaining Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou for nearly 3 years. The U.S. has fabricated a slew of excuses to clamp down on China's high-tech enterprises with global competitiveness and has put more than 1,000 Chinese enterprises on sanction lists. In addition, the U.S. has also imposed controls on biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and other high-end technologies, reinforced export restrictions, tightened investment screening, suppressed Chinese social media apps such as TikTok and WeChat, and lobbied the Netherlands and Japan to restrict exports of chips and related equipment or technology to China. The U.S. has also practiced double standards in policy on China-related technological professionals to sideline and suppress Chinese researchers. Since June 2018, visa validity has been shortened for Chinese students majoring in certain high-tech-related disciplines. Repeated cases have occurred where Chinese scholars and students go to the U.S. for exchange programs and study were unjustifiably denied, harassed, and large-scale investigation on Chinese scholars working in the U.S. was carried out. The U.S. solidifies its technological monopoly by the name of protecting democracy by building small blocks of technology such as the CHIPS Alliance and Clean Network. The U.S. has put democracy and human rights labels on high technology and turned technological issues into political and ideological issues to fabricate excuses for its technological blockade against the other countries. In May 2019, the U.S. enlisted 32 countries to the Prague 5G Security Conference in the Czech Republic and issued the Prague Proposal in an attempt to exclude China's 5G products. In April 22, then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the 5G Clean Path, a plan designed to build a technological alliance in the 5G field with partners bonded by their shared ideology on democracy and the need to protect cybersecurity. The measures, in essence, are the U.S. attempts to maintain its technological hegemony through technological alliances. The U.S. abuses its technological hegemony by carrying out cyber attacks and eavesdropping. The U.S. has long been notorious as an empire of hackers blamed for its rampant acts of cyber theft around the world. It has all kinds of means to enforce pervasive cyber attacks on surveillance, including using analog-based station signals to access mobile phones for data theft, manipulating mobile apps, infiltrating cloud servers, and stealing through undersea cables. The list goes on. U.S. surveillance is indiscriminate. All can be targets of its surveillance, be they rivals, allies, even leaders of allied countries such as former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and several French presidents. Cyber surveillance and attacks launched by the U.S. such as PRISM, Dirtbox, Irritant Horn, and Telescreen Operation are all proof that U.S. is closely monitoring its allies and partners. Such eavesdropping on allies and partners has already caused worldwide outrage. Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, a website that's exposed U.S. surveillance programs, said, "Do not expect a global surveillance superpower to act with honor or respect. There's only one rule. There are no rules." Cultural hegemony, spreading false narratives. The global expansion of American culture is an important part of its external strategy. The U.S. has often used cultural tools to strengthen and maintain its hegemony in the world. The U.S. embeds American values in its products, such as movies. American values and lifestyle are tied to its movies, TV shows, publications, media, content, programs, government-funded nonprofit cultural institutions. It thus shapes a cultural and public opinion space in which American culture reigns and maintains cultural hegemony. In his article, The Americanization of the World, John Yema, an American scholar, exposed the real weapons in U.S. cultural expansion: Hollywood, the image design factories on Madison Avenue, and the production lines of Mattel Company and Coca-Cola. These are various vehicles the U.S. uses to keep its cultural hegemony. American movies are the most used. They now occupy more than 70% of the world's market share. The U.S. skillfully exploits its cultural diversity to appeal to various ethnicities. When Hollywood movies descend on the world, they scream the American values tied to them. American cultural hegemony not only shows itself in direct intervention, but also in media infiltration, and as a trumpet for the world. U.S.-dominated Western media has a particularly important role in shaping global public opinion in favor of U.S. meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. The U.S. government strictly censors all social media companies and demands their obedience. Twitter CEO Elon Musk admitted on December 27, 2022, that all social media platforms work with the U.S. government to censor content, reported Fox Business Network. Public opinion in the U.S. is subject to government intervention to restrict all unfavorable remarks. Google often makes pages disappear. The U.S. Departments of Defense manipulate social media. In December 2022, The Intercept, an independent U.S. investigative website, revealed that in July 2017, U.S. Central Command Officer Nathaniel Collar instructed Twitter's public policy team to augment the presence of 52 Arab language accounts on lists he sent, 6 of which were to be given priority. One of the 6 was dedicated to justifying U.S. drone attacks in Yemen, such as by claiming that the attacks were precise and killed only terrorists, not civilians. Following Collar's directive, Twitter put those Arabic language accounts on a white list to amplify certain messages. The U.S. practices double standards on the freedom of the press. It brutally suppresses and silences the media of other countries by various means. The U.S. states and Europe bar mainstream Russian media such as Russia Today and Sputnik from their countries. Platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube openly restrict official accounts of Russia. Netflix, Apple, and Google have removed Russian channels and applications from their services and app stores. Unprecedented draconian censorship is imposed on Russian-related content. The U.S. abuses its cultural its cultural hegemony to instigate peaceful evolution in socialist countries. It sets up news media and cultural outfits targeting socialist countries. It pours staggering amounts of public funds into radio and TV networks to support their ideological infiltration. And these mouthpieces bombard socialist countries in dozens of languages with inflammatory propaganda day and night. The U.S. uses misinformation as a spear to attack other countries and has built an industrial chain around it. There are groups and individuals making up stories and peddling them worldwide to mislead public opinion with the support of nearly limitless financial resources. While a just cause wins its champion-wide support, an unjust one condemns its pursuer to be an outcast. The hegemonic, domineering, and bullying practices of using strength to intimidate the weak, taking from others by force and subterfuge, and playing zero-sum games are exerting grave harm. The historical trends of peace, development, cooperation, and mutual benefit are unstoppable. The U.S. has been overriding truth with its power and trampling justice to serve self-interest. These unilateral, egoistic, and regressive hegemonic practices have drawn growing, intense criticism and opposition from the international community. Countries need to respect each other and treat each other as equals. Big countries should behave in a manner befitting their status and take the lead in pursuing a new model of state-to-state relations featuring dialogue and partnership, not confrontation or alliance. China opposes all forms of hegemonism and power politics and rejects interference in other countries' internal affairs. The U.S. must conduct serious soul-searching. It must critically examine what's done and let go of its arrogance and prejudice and quit its hegemonic, domineering, and bullying practices. And here is a take on it from the Duran. China and Russia align to challenge collective West.
Alexander, let's talk about these documents, position papers that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has published. We have the Global Security Initiative concept paper, and then kind of underneath that you have another paper with the title U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils. Makes for an interesting read. What's your take on these papers?
Well, they're an extraordinary read. I mean, the Chinese, the global security concept paper, I think we can, to some extent, disregard because it flows from the other. What the Chinese are doing is they're now accepting that they're in an adversarial relationship with the United States. I mean, this is now, it seems to me, a formal statement from China. These papers are a formal statement from China that there are now two poles in the world again. There's the American and there's the Chinese. The Chinese say the Americans conduct foreign policy this way. The Chinese say we conduct foreign policy in a different way. And that's what the concept paper is all about. The more interesting one and the easier one to read and the more, shall we say, colourful and vivid one is the one in which they discuss US hegemony. And I have to say it's astonishing. I mean, it is an absolute attack, a frontal assault on US foreign policy and the way it's conducted. Now, straight away, I have to say I agree with, most of us here on the Duran would agree with an awful lot of what's there. I mean, they say straight away that the United States disregards international law. It's very critical of this concept of the rules-based international order. It says that this is an attempt to demolish international law. It says that the US instigates wars. It interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. It doesn't accept that other countries have a right to develop in their own way. It tries to remodel their political systems. It engages in color revolutions, and it gives a whole list of countries where there have been color revolutions. It says that the United States is extremely warlike. It calls the United States the most warlike of all countries. It catalogues various US military interventions. It also talks about US economic abuse, if you like, the abuse the United States makes of its economic position, its manipulation of the dollar system to its own advantage. It talks about the US looting most of the world, for its own benefit. It talks about how the United States tries to prevent other countries' technological development. It gives an example of Japan in the 1980s. It says that the United States is trying to do the same thing to China as well. And in some ways, for me, the most interesting section, I say interesting because it's new coming from the Chinese, is that there's a whole section about how the United States is trying to spread its own value system through culture, through media, through social media, through films, and the way that this is immensely disruptive of values and traditions in other countries, and is ultimately corrupting to those systems. So it's an extraordinary paper, actually. But let's take a step back, because we've heard all of this from someone else, and the person we've heard it from is Vladimir Putin. I mean, if you think about this, this is very, very similar to the critique that Vladimir Putin, I wouldn't say similar, I'd say it's identical to the critique that Vladimir Putin has been making of US policy now for several years. He even attended, if you remember, a session at Davos about 2 years ago. And in front of people like Klaus Schwab, he made all these kind of attacks. He's talked about unipolarity, the US quest for hegemony. He's been doing that ever since the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where he delivered that famous speech with Senator McCain fuming in the front row. So what we now see is that the Chinese have wholesale accepted the Russian critique of US foreign policy, of the globalist foreign policy as well, because that also plays a part of that, but they particularly focus it on the United States. So what we now have, and it's very straightforward, is a complete conceptual, even ideological convergence between the Chinese and the Russians about foreign policy. The Chinese are now saying we're against American exceptionalism, against what the neocons are doing, and though the Chinese still sometimes pretend that they are supporters of globalization, it's difficult to read this position paper and not feel that they've accepted again the Russian view that globalization is a bad thing. The kind of globalization that Klaus Schwab and some people in the West have been promoting from a Chinese point of view and a Russian point of view is now a bad thing. So we now have the Chinese converging with the Russians as they decide that, from their point of view, the United States is an adversary. It's almost, if you like, the enemy, and they're part now of this partnership with the Russians, pushing back against all of these things.
Okay, so the Chinese, obviously, they understand that if things go badly for Russia with this conflict in Ukraine, and Russia's eventually, let's say, balkanized by Newland and Sullivan, Blinken, Biden, the plan to get regime change in Russia and balkanize Russia with the defeat in Ukraine. The Chinese understand that they're next. So that's one way to explain this paper. But another way to look at this paper is to look at the Chinese as saying, Russia is winning, and the 80% of the global South has not moved away from Russia's position in this conflict with the collective West. And so the time is right for us now, as China, as the big partner in this new system that's being set up. Now is the time for us to assert ourselves and say, here we are. We're here. This is our position. This is what we offer the world. Who wants to try out this new way of doing things? I guess the question to you is, China would not be coming out with this paper if they didn't understand that things are going very well, not only for Russia, but in the war, not only for Russia in the war, but also in terms of the sanctions, of the economic war, of moving away from the U.S. dollar, in energy. I mean, I think they feel comfortable with the situation, yes, so that they can now come out and say, here we are, and we're the leader of this new system, or we're going to take the lead in this new system.
Exactly. And this is exactly what it is. Now, can I just say, first of all, let's talk about the first point about Ukraine. Let's specifically talk about Ukraine, which is not really, this is a much bigger thing than just Ukraine. But Wang Yi, who is now in overall charge of Chinese foreign policy, is in Moscow. He's had a whole succession of meetings. He's met Patrushev, who's the head of the Security Council, very powerful man, Putin's national security advisor, the man who's also in overall charge of the Russian intelligence community. He had a very, very big session with Lavrov, and he's also met Putin himself. And we know that part of the purpose of his visit to Moscow is to prepare the ground for Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, which is now expected at some point next month. So Xi Jinping is heading to Moscow. Now, over the course of all of these meetings, there was a discussion between Lavrov and Wang Yi. And we've only got one readout so far. It's very sketchy, and it comes from the Russian Foreign Ministry. But it said that the Chinese and the Russians agree about what was the root cause of the Ukrainian conflict. So that means, if we follow it through, that the Chinese also agree with the Russians about what caused the Ukrainian conflict, because the Russians have set it out in enormous amounts of detail. Now, given that that is so, and given that, as you absolutely rightly say, the Chinese understand that this is a neocon project, and that the neocons, if they manage to succeed in Ukraine, would move on to come after China once they've broken up, fragmented, pulped Russia, imposed their own kind of system on Russia. The Chinese are not going to let that happen. And I think this is the thing people now need to understand. If the US goes on escalating in Ukraine, the Chinese, for the moment, want to keep their distance. They don't want to be seen visibly sending arms to Ukraine. But if they go on escalating to the point where it really looks as if the Russians might get into trouble, the Chinese will step in. And they will not allow Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, because it has now become a matter of vital strategic interest to the Chinese that the Russians don't lose. Now, that's an important point to understand, but it's come out clearly both from Wang Yi's visit and from what is contained in all of these position papers. So that's the first thing to say. But the second thing, and it's the second point that you were making, is actually the more important one. Because why have the Chinese come out with all these things now? They've come out with all of these things now for exactly the reason that you say. They feel they can, because the drift of world opinion is in their favor. It's moving towards these positions, which Putin very courageously outlined years ago, but they're obviously now gaining increasing traction around the world. We're seeing this currently at the current UN General Assembly session, where it seems the West is having great trouble putting together a resolution, a General Assembly resolution, critical of Russia over Ukraine. What we're hearing is that it's been basically stripped of all substance. But even that is apparently having problems getting traction there. So the Chinese see that. They see that global opinion is turning against the US, that the Saudis are drifting away from the US, that the Brazilians refuse to get involved in the war in Ukraine, that Mexico is speaking out, that the African leaders are siding with the Russians, that everybody seems to be increasingly exasperated with the neocons and with the Americans and with the EU, which is, of course, the neocons' willing accomplice. And the Chinese are saying, this is our moment. We are far and away the most powerful country that is rivaling the US. This is our moment. This is the moment when we can come out, say to the world straightforwardly, this is what America, the neocons in America, how they conduct foreign policy. And we are your champion. We will stand with you all around the world as you resist it. And we've come up with our alternative foreign policy, our alternative vision of the world, which is all, of course, about cooperation and friendship and respecting international law and respecting the rights of countries to choose their own destinies, and is opposed to interference in internal affairs and all of those things. So you see that the Chinese sense that this is their moment and they're seizing it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the real war. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine is, to me, is a battle in this larger war, which is the movement from a unipolar, neoliberal, globalist world order to something else, or at least having the option to have something else. Doesn't mean the one goes away, but at least now you're going to have a different system that other countries, specifically countries in the global south, maybe even NATO members like Turkey, maybe even EU members like Hungary, they can look at this alternative system and they can say, this is interesting. Maybe I'll look further into the way they're doing things and look into their organizations and the way they provide financing, or the way they can help out on an economic level or on a trade level or even on a military level. So I mean, it does provide a new alternate system for a lot of the countries in the world that up until today were stuck with just one player, and that was this neoliberal globalist thing. And so that
and from ippmedia.com, China urges U.S. to abandon hegemony and bullying. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson Friday said that U.S. is not accustomed to hearing the truth, is still less willing to force the problems. Spokesperson Wang Wenbin made the remarks in response to U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns' tweet regarding a U.S.-related report released by the Chinese side. Wang said the report is nothing but telling the truth and objectively presenting the U.S. hegemonic and bullying behavior to the world. Noting power and coercive diplomacy, the spokesperson said it's nothing like a powerful country's demeanor and suggested an American ambassador should report the true voice to Washington. The U.S. should refrain from seeking hegemony or bullying, respect other countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity, and seek a path of peaceful coexistence and win-win results. Okay, and at this point,